Our next speaker is Hilton Wilson, who has experience with 707s as well, as you already know. 31 years of experience in the game that he's in at the moment, and that's looking into aircraft accidents. He is the sort of, in my language, the go-between between the aircraft owner and the insurance company. So he's an insurance loss assessor. To me, that meant nothing to start with, and hopefully by the time Hilton finishes, we'll know all about what a loss assessor does. Hilton, over to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know if you have given any thought, but today is the oldest you have ever been, but the youngest you will ever be. I like the occasional saying, they have a lot of substance. Who am I? Well, from a very abbreviated point of view, you've got my name. In 1955, I sought my aviation passion as an apprentice with Qantas, and stuck with them for 12 years before moving on into other areas, including general aviation. So basically 59 years have passed by to this time. The next question is, what am I? In simple terms, I'm an aviation loss adjuster. More broadly, it's explained as an assessor and a loss adjuster, and it gets involved beyond that to degrees that most people would not even imagine. I guess most people, when they hear about somebody's profession, you just formulate in your own mind roughly what it's all about, but like we all know, in our own little areas of profession, there's a lot that never gets to the surface. A lot of it's boring, a lot of it's absolutely necessary, but at the end of the day, it's all part of what we do. Just a quick coverage on my background, and that, as I said, was 12 years through my apprenticeship and onwards with Qantas. At the end of my apprenticeship, there were 76 of us that started in 1955, and I decided to stay in the engineering system and move on to the outstation pool, whereas others went flying as flight engineers across the country and into Cathay Pacific and such like, and even with Qantas into Hong Kong and so on. Others decided to move on to some odd place called Bankstown that had little aeroplanes. And to me, in those days, I scratched my head. I didn't know what they were really doing, but I figured they wanted to play with these little toy things. Little did I know that in 1969 I was going to do the same thing and join the general aviation industry. From there, I was part of the Cessna dealership, Western Australia. Was chief engineer for service manager for about 12 years, and it was during the period of what I call the halcyon days, when every second person was buying a Cessna or a Piper or a Beech. It was just like selling Holdens almost. Thoroughly enjoyable, a great time, and the expansion of general aviation in those days was on a weekly basis. But a part of my life that I'll never forget, enjoyed very much, and of course was the forerunner to where I am today. The actual loss adjusting process, I'll just run through it very briefly with you, so that you've got some idea of what the process and mechanics of it is. Because quite often I get people, when I'm involved in a claim, who have expressed very limited ideas about where I fit into the picture, and it ends up, by the time we've finished going through the whole claim, they've got a very different idea. So what does the loss adjuster do? Well, initially he investigates, after being appointed to the claim, he investigates the accident, he records the damage, he assesses the damage, he interviews the pilot and the passengers and witnesses, he arranges for the recovery from the crash site, he writes reports, he organises and monitors repairs, he arranges claim settlement, he has liaison throughout with lawyers, the police, the insured, the employees, employers, family, the HSB. We go on to manage third-party claims, and we put aircraft out for tender, and it goes on. So there is a reasonable amount of individual processes that we have to comply with depending on the type of accident. There is an old saying, there is no future in the past, but all my experience has been gained from the past. And just checking back on the history of 31 years of this particular job as a loss adjuster, I've actually covered 1,333 accident claims, which averages 43 per year. So that might surprise some people, because I often speak to people about it and they say, well, is that all you do? And I say, yes, why? And they say, oh, well, didn't think there'd be enough business for you. Well, 43 a year, and some of them are fairly sizable. You're talking one a week at least. And it just so happens they don't all fall nicely at one a week. Just getting closer to the present time, this financial year I've actually done 47 claims, so I'm slightly above the average of 43, and they vary considerably, and of course the locations that they happen in vary. They don't all happen at Jandakot Airport. And I thought I'd just run through the 47. I'll just run through as just headings on them, no detail, no involvement in the accidents. But in 21 of the 47, I thought they'd be interesting just to hear, you know, what the jobs were and what the insurance companies have to contend with, and how we carry out our loss adjusting. So, starting early in the year, there was a Landcare crashed on takeoff out of Geraldton. At Wickham, a brand spanking new hangar that had only been finished on the day before the cyclone. They put a Cessna 182 in there out of the kindness of their heart to look after it, and the hangar got ripped off the ground and collapsed onto the 182. The same cyclone twisted a Twin Otter off its tie-down cables, and it did $300,000 worth of damage. I had a Cessna 206 prop strike at Parafield. I had a Navajo do a wheels-up landing just after takeoff out of Aldinga, which is in South Australia. I had a Yak 52 inadvertently retract the undercarriage during taxi. I had a Mooney inadvertently land with the wheels up at Halls Creek. At Marla on the Stewart Highway in South Australia, I had a C40 441, which is a Conquest, blow a nose wheel tyre, and the extent of damage from the gravel that came from that blown wheel destroyed 2 engines, 2 propellers, the pilot's windscreen and windows, and that side of the fuselage. I had a two Cessna 10s in Broome, prop strikes and nose wheel collapse. I had a twin Seneca fly into trees on landing at Denmark. A Cessna 172 prop strike at Bunbury. A Cessna 172 at Beverley taxied into a tree with a wing. I had ice ingestion in the King Air between Tasmania and South Australia. We had a very sad demise of a Stager Wing recently at Dardanup through an engine failure on takeoff. Had a 206 out of Newman on takeoff with an engine failure, force landed. Recently had a Cessna 172 pick on Skippy down at Murrayfield. Neither come off any good. With a B-55 sitting on jacks in a hangar at Port Hedland, and some local contractors had a concrete cutter that he turned away from for a few minutes, and in that time the concrete cutter self-propelled across the runway, reached a speed of an estimated 65 kilometres an hour, entered the hangar, removed the left-hand landing gear of a Baron that was sitting on the jacks, and offered to pay for it until they found out what it was going to cost. And then had a Baron 55 do a wheels-up landing, retracted the gear after landing at Bunbury. We've had a serious glass air accident at South Lakes. Had a fatal Ayers thrush crash at Ayers Rock. And at York, not so long ago, they had a big fly-in for skydivers. And a particular pilot bent the prop on a caravan, which is quite an expensive episode. He then hopped out of that and got in a Cresco, turbine Cresco, flew to 14,000 feet. On descent at 4,000 feet a minute, the canopy came off. He fortunately leant forward to adjust the radio as the canopy sliced his headrest in half. So the guy that owned the business was a fairly enterprising young fellow and normally a cool-headed person. I met him at the time and he said, I've just recovered from another incident, and I said, well, that's 3 for the day, and he said, yes. He said, I just felt so fed up with it all that I thought I'd go and do a free-fall jump, and during the free-fall jump he actually collided with another jumper and knocked himself out. So by the time he came to and got himself organised, he landed safely, and I shared a beer with him that afternoon, or 3. So that's just 21 of this year's stories about loss adjusting. They are variable, as you can see, and also, the only place I mentioned twice there was Bunbury. The rest of them were spread across the state. I do occasionally get into the Northern Territory, as you'll see later, and South Australia. So, yes, there's travel involved. It's interesting. It's enjoyable, and at the moment I'm resisting retiring because, it's just one of those very fortunate disciplines in aviation that is enjoyable. Now, when discussing today with Brian Herman, the decision to make this 45 minutes was entertaining rather than provide you with grim accidents and investigations and the outfall of those investigations. So it's mostly a mixture of humour, some experiences I've had and some yarns that I think put another slant on this particular job. And I just hope that you get a bit of a smile out of some of it, and see that although a lot of it's very serious and a lot of it's interesting and challenging, at the end of the day there is 2 sides to it. And I remember when Brian said to me way back months ago, he said, would you like to give a talk? And I said, yeah, I don't mind. And he said, with all the years you've been involved, surely there must be some funny stories. And then my initial thought was, not much funny about aeroplanes crashing and people being hurt or killed or aeroplanes being destroyed. But of course, when I sat down and went through a bit of the history, I did discover that you absent-mindedly quite often collect a lot of information via your photography and your memories with respect to some of the jobs. And when I did find the time to go through it, I found enough to probably either entertain you or bore you. So we'll start with this is a picture at Halls Creek many years ago in the early days of my loss adjusting, and it was in the days where you can see that you had to manually pick your seat. Today we can Today you can do it electronically. Actually, the guy involved there picking your seat, Stan, was the local rouseabout on the airport. He was a gold prospector. He was a character. I don't think I ever saw him without a rollie in his mouth. And he was there just to help us get organised for the flight. So he was a great guy, but he's passed on now. This is a short story about a call I got years ago when a Shrike took off out of Port Hedland and one engine failed, and so the aircraft was ditched into Port Hedland Harbour. It was school holiday time, and I set about trying to organise a flight up to Port Hedland. In those days we could talk to the ATSB on a friendly basis and communicate on a cooperative basis, and they were also having problems getting a flight to Port Hedland. So we spoke to the people remotely and the police, and we all agreed that the best thing we could do was at least get it out of the harbour, because at that stage it had stopped a lot of iron ore boats from being able to come and go. So there she is being lifted out of the harbour, and we eventually got a flight up a week later due to availability of seats. Now, when we got there, we met the police, and they said to us, look, there it is, and we assure you that no one's touched it, no one's even been near it. We've left it locked up just as it is. We assure you that there's been full security and there's nothing to worry about. So we thanked them very much, and they all moved on. And anyway, myself and one of the ATSB guys walked up to the aeroplane, and I thought we'd have a look inside, and we opened the door, and I can't describe the smell that came out of the aeroplane. It was just unbelievable, indescribable. In fact, we didn't even look to see what the smell was. We just backed off and virtually looked at each other and thought, what on earth is that? As it turned out, that aeroplane was on departure for a community, and the pilot was the only person on board, and he was okay, of course. But what was inside was hundreds of chickens, hundreds of rolls of processed meat, and a myriad of other types of perishable food. So being summertime, you can imagine the ambient temperature is probably around the 38 degrees or more. What the temperature was inside, we don't know, but it certainly was substantially higher. But everything that was in there was well cooked. And so we thank the police very much for looking after it for us. That's in the Northern Territory, and for those who are not sure, it's a Cessna 182. That's the other side of it, and this is a bit of a story this time, but it's an interesting one. The pilot had gone out to do a stock check on an area on his station, and he obviously was circling the yards where the animals were, and probably checking the water troughs, etc. And obviously one of the wings got a bit too close to the ground, and as a result, the aeroplane got out of control, and it finished up doing some somersaults to the point where the fin of the aircraft, it was actually down the windscreen, so it was rolled up pretty tight. He was on his own, and by nightfall, when he hadn't returned home, his wife tried to contact him, and there was no reply. So she organised a couple from the station and they went out looking, but unfortunately it was getting dark by the time they reached the location that she last knew he was at, which was these yards. So they drove around, had spotlights, and they drove around and there was just no sign of the aircraft, and she thought, well, knowing him, he's probably landed somewhere else, can't communicate, and being the typical sort of station owner, he'll be okay, he'll just bunk down for the night and we'll sort things out the next day. But actually what happened was he'd gone just beyond a ridge as he crashed and down into a gully, so that when she drove around, the headlights of the car, spotlights didn't pick him up. Well, he was actually, during that time, still strapped in his seat upside down. And this was some hours later. Eventually, when he came to, it was pitch black, and it was, he thinks, he's not sure, but somewhere around midnight. So he's been inverted for quite a long time. So it says something for the human body when you can stay upside down that long and still come to. But he actually came to and wasn't sure where he was or what was happening, so he thought he'd release his seatbelt anyway. Fortunately, he was a big man and his neck and his head took it, but his legs were very badly damaged, and eventually he finished up in Darwin Hospital. I went there to visit him, and we switched the story now to some 12 months later when I get a phone call to say that he's back in hospital again. And my first thoughts were, you know, what's he done? But in actual fact, he was in the yard with some bulls, and one of the bulls didn't like him and actually gored him and missed his heart by centimetres and went through one lung. So after that, he decided to employ a manager for the station. And there have been other stories about him, and one of them, which is interesting, is that while we visited him on a sales service trip many years before all of this, the weather changed overnight and the runway turned into sort of a black butter consistency. So he said, well, you guys are stuck here for the night, what are you going to do? And we said, I don't know, we'll hang around. And he said, well, you better come shopping with us. Now, it's right down near Victoria River Down Station, so you can imagine I'm wondering where one would go shopping. Well, we all got in the vehicle the next day and we didn't ask any questions, and across the top of the Clare Shield was a rifle, and we went down some pretty rough roads, and we went for about an hour and a half and finally came to this open paddock, and we started circling around and the bulls were running everywhere, and I said to him, which one are you choosing? He said, that one there, and it was sort of a white colour, and as a result the bull knew that he was the target, so he was making it very difficult, but eventually he took the gun out and shot the bull, and myself and Kevin Mann, who was with me at the time, had a lesson in butchery. On the way back I said to him, can I ask why you actually chose that particular bull? And he said, yeah, it was the neighbours. This is a short story, but it's one in which I went up to the Kimberleys to investigate. All I got told was that this Cessna 210 had crashed on takeoff, and all the people on board had survived. There was no dramas. So at the station, we went through the processes, and as you can see, it was a brand new 210, and it got really munched. Both wings were like that. And anyway, later on in the afternoon, we were sitting around the table and having a cup of tea and talking about it, and I'm taking notes, and I just said to them, I said, well, I better get the names of the passengers, and one of them who actually owned the aeroplane and was contemplating buying that property was Kerry Packer. So you can see how close Kerry Packer came to probably not making it, but the story behind it was that the pilot hadn't done his homework and he took off on what he thought was the runway, but it was actually the roadway down to the taxiway to the runway. Kerry kept him on because he saved his life. I just went out to one in the Gascoigne many years ago, and I was talking to the pilot and I said, how'd you finish up down here like this? And he just said, oh, A bit embarrassed, he said, but I was flying along and I was trying to drop a tool pouch out to one of the boys down there. He said, and I was trying to get an accurate drop, and I forgot to fly the aeroplane. He stalled it, but he got out of it and made a mess of it. That's just another short story from Cape Levique. I was talking to the passengers after the accident. This was a takeoff accident that never got airborne. And I was talking to the passengers and I said, well, how do you feel about all this, and can you tell me anything about it? And one of them said to me, well, we were warned about the Kimberleys being full of surprises, but we didn't count this as being one of them. But the pilot had tried to shut the window that came open on takeoff, and being a bit short, he was trying to reach behind him, and of course the aeroplane followed him and finished up in the bush. Another brand new 210. There's a mining site that I went to and spoke to the pilot, and he couldn't tell me how come he'd stalled, but he did stall and he wasn't sure why. But when I looked into the cabin, there was actually one of these tree branches that had penetrated right through the firewall between the pilot and the co-pilot seat. So during dinner that night, someone whispered in my ear that if you want to know the truth, they were flower bombing. This is on a lake north of Carnarvon. It's a salt lake, but as you can see, not far under the surfaces of water. It's about 1.5 kilometres out the aeroplane, so it was quite a trudge. But later on, when I was talking to the pilot, I said, how the hell did you finish up out there? And he said, I needed a comfort stop. And I said, well, surely you must have known from all your training that you don't stop in the middle of a lake. If you're going to stop anywhere on a lake, you stop on the edge where it's a lot harder. He said, I was in a hurry. Well, if you see these tracks here, that's us coming out, and that's also the tracks the people that came out or went back from the crash site. Those tracks there happen to be a very scared emu. This is just one that just demonstrates how interesting it can be looking for an aeroplane that's crashed. This is south of Cocklebiddie. It's down towards the coastline. That was a beautiful day, spring day, and we were given the coordinates that were supplied by the police to us, but they were supplied to them by the guy from down Esperance with an R44 that rescued the pilot. So on those coordinates we set off in a squirrel to just have a look at it late in the afternoon, knowing what we would be going back to the next day. And so, you know, that was pretty much spot on the coordinates that we were given. And I know where the aeroplane is, but I would say that there's very few people in this room would find it. And we're only trotting around at about 1,000 feet at that stage. Getting a bit closer to where we thought it was, and bearing in mind that the R44 pilot had given the police the coordinates of where he landed, which was 1 kilometre from the crash site, so it was very helpful. But I don't know whether anyone can see the aircraft at the moment, but sorry, we found it. Get my buttons right. It's there. It's there. There. The pilot was an actual ag pilot, and he side-slipped it in at the last minute. It was an engine failure in flight, and it finished up vertical against a tree with the engine stuck in between two branches. The next day we went back to land there, and that's what we were faced with weather. And so the game started all over again, trying to find it. But fortunately we reset our GPS, and we were a lot more accurate in their location. But we went from a perfect spring day to almost hypothermia the next day. There's a short story about a trip to Feathernard Island, which is north of Dampier, and the pilot of this helicopter had about 12,000 hours experience, and 8,000 of those was in the Antarctica. And he was doing ship to shore with a sling load and a big box in it, to and fro with whatever. And when he was leaving the island base to go back to the ship, he got the thumbs up from the guys down on the ground. But as he flew back towards the ship, he could hear a thumping noise, and when he looked into the mirror, he couldn't see the sling load. So he thought, well, it's certainly not where I would like it to be, and that's up around the tail rotor, so he released it. And unfortunately, when he released it, it did go through the tail rotor, and that was the end result. So when I was flying out to the island with this young flyer and another Jet Ranger, he was very vocal about how stupid this pilot was and what he would have done if he was flying, and carried on like a pork chop for about half an hour. And I listened to this guy and I thought, okay. So about 3 months later, I got a call to go back to Karratha, and this was his helicopter. And he had done a similar thing. He'd gone out to Barrow Island and come back, but he hadn't fitted the mirrors, which he should have done, so he couldn't see his sling load. The engineer on the ground gave him a thumbs up to drop the load, which he did do, and he gave him a thumbs up to hover away from it. And in between that, the pilot was supposed to release the sling load. Well, the latch didn't actually release, so as he hovered sideways, the engineer went running like you wouldn't believe, because this thing was now gyrating over onto its side, and of course the rotor blades hit the ground. I found 6 foot of one rotor blade up on dug in the asphalt at the Bristow hangar, 300 metres away. I did inquire about this pilot's future, and it turns out that I'm advised he became a doorman at the Allendale Square building in St George's Terrace. That's Victoria River Down Station. Most of the stations out in the far north are large, but Victoria River Downs is a super big station. A lot of interest there. There's a museum was a museum with aircraft in it. Very big helicopter maintenance base, and so on. Anyway, I had to go out there for a Robinson accident, and that's another angle of the station. The Victoria River, of course, is there where all the trees are, so they're right on the river. Anyway, the helicopter's down here, and I promptly went over to it and opened my toolbox and started investigating the cause of this accident. Come lunchtime, I went over and spent lunch with the boys, and then I went back to carry on with the work I was doing. I went through my toolbox looking for a number of tools which seemed to have disappeared, and I couldn't work it out, and I thought, oh, well, I've left them somewhere. So I searched everywhere, and when I couldn't find them, I went back to the workshop and I said to the guys, something strange is going on. I said, during lunch, a lot of my tools have disappeared. Oh, said one of the guys, I forgot to tell you about Cedric. I said, who's Cedric? Cedric's a local emu that pinches tools. And we don't know where he puts them. So I had to adjust my fees when I got back. It's a story of interest that I was on Three Rivers Station, which is midway between Meekatharra and Newman. And the people there had a Cessna 150 for many years, gone through a few generations, but it never had a hangar. And there had been more regular maintenance carried out by Northern Air Services by virtue of fly in, fly out. The most recent engineer at Northern said to them one day, and I'm going back quite a few years now, he said to them, you know, this aeroplane's deteriorating badly out in the open, why don't you get a hangar? I mean, and make life easier for me doing 100 hourly instead of out in the bush and the dust. So I thought about it for a while and decided that that wasn't a bad idea, and the neighbours actually had a hangar for sale. So they purchased a hangar and put the concrete footings in and erected the hangar and put the aeroplane in it. The cyclone passed through 2 days later. So after 10 or 15 years of sitting out in the open, he finally took his advice and put it in a hangar, and that's after the hangar was lifted off the aeroplane, by the way. This gentleman I've become friends with over the years bought a Cessna 210, a very early one with struts. And I got a call to say that he'd had a prop strike at Meekatharra. Well, being a little bit cautious of the reports I get from pilots, I decided that I should go and take a look and see if it was a bit more just a prop strike. Sure enough, it was firewall, nose leg, prop, and you name it. So after we got the aeroplane repaired, he decided that he would venture into something a bit better, like a twin-engine aeroplane, and he opted for a good old push-pull 337. So he bought this one locally, and it was an absolutely immaculate 337. He also bought property and some units up in Exmouth for regular stays, and on this particular flight, the aeroplane is at Exmouth. He loaded up the cargo pod with all the crockery, red wine, all the steaks and various other food products, and off he went, and he took a friend with him. Well, needless to say, he forgot to put the gear down when he landed. Well, they managed to get along the runway and salvage some of what was in the cargo pod, and unfortunately, because of the type of landing, and both props ended up striking the ground and the fuselage got twisted, and sadly it was written off. So I'm up there and we're sort of at the end of the day, and I said to him, well, I'm going back to the hotel, and he said, well, whatever you do, come and join us for dinner. And while we're cooking dinner, he said, this is actually the barbecue steaks that come off the runway, and this is the only bottle of red wine that survived. So we moved on from there, and he replaced the aeroplane with another 337. That was picked up in Albury, I think. I won't go into who was on board, but he was on board as well. And they flew it all the way back across Australia to Exmouth and forgot to put the gear down again. How am I going to time? In my very early days as a loss adjuster, I finished up out in the central desert on the Gun Barrel Highway. Cessna 210 with 90 hours on the clock, and the pilot had landed on what he thought was a runway, and it turned out to just be a clearing. And of course, with insufficient runway length, it went up over the Gun Barrel Highway, which was elevated a couple of metres. And as it came out the other side, it became inverted and finished upside down. Because of the location, I decided that I would take out the engine and instruments and avionics. We had a Cessna 303 with us at the time, and at least we'd get that back safely, because we knew that not much would last once we left the site. I was on my own at the time. The Department of Transport guys had gone up just up the road to take notes from the pilot and so on. They were gone for about 4 hours, and I nearly dehydrated because I didn't know how much water I would need in my first off experience. And when they came back, I said, where have you guys been? They said, just up the road. I learnt the country talk because it was 180 k's to the campsite, 180 k's back. So just up the road out there is not just up the road. Those guys came and helped me, pull things apart. We actually hid the aeroplane in the bush. But while I was there on my own, a four-wheel drive tray top with kids and dogs and Mum and Dad pulled up, and Dad put his foot up on the windscreen, rolled himself a cigarette and said nothing for about 5 minutes. And then he said, "Did I often park them like that?" So I was past the point of humour at that stage. So I took me back to the camp for a shower, and I asked him where the shower room was, and that was the whole laundry, bathroom, kitchen, the works. I won't show you the thunderbox, but on the sink on the left there was a piece of tree trunk with about 35 toothbrushes all sitting in holes. It was quite fascinating. Maddington probably comes to the mind of a lot of people. So dromeder that went out to do a firebomb and got airborne and ran into engine problems and finished up crashing into a house. And if you look closely, that's a piece of roof timber that came between the pilot's feet. If you look closely, there's some more roof timbers going through the windscreen past his head. So I guess you could say he was lucky. Yeah. So anyway, Mike Smith. So anyway, I did some interviewing for people around, and the guy at the house behind was sitting out in his patio having a quiet afternoon drink, and he said, "I heard this bang." He said, "What amazed me was the house behind me moved about a foot." And then he said it came back. You know, I thought, well, something's gone strange here. So anyway, I interviewed the people next door, and they'd actually lost a section of their roof. There was a hole about 1 metre diameter on top of their roof where the undercarriage had picked on it just before hitting this house. And I spoke to the husband and wife or parents there, and they said that they hadn't actually seen it happen, but they'd gone out the front when they heard the noise. Of course, by then half the street's out there and so on. So I said, "Was anyone else here?" And they said, "Yes, our daughter was here, and she's still here if you want to talk to her." So lying on the bed in another room was daughter, covered in tattoos, with more rings in her ears and nose than you have in a sail. And I said to her, "What can you tell me?" And she said, "Well, I was just lying on my back, and all of a sudden there was this horrendous noise." And she said, "My first thoughts was, why is my car going over the roof?" And I thought, I'm not sure I want to record this interview, but anyway, I said, "How did you have that sort of query?" She said, "Well, I've just had my Toyota Celica repainted yellow." And she said, "First there was this hole, and then there was this yellow thing going over, and all I could think of was, it's my car." So anyway, I asked her a few questions. I said, I said, "Are you working?" She said, "No, I've just lost my job." And I said, "Oh, what were you doing?" And she said, "Oh, I'm a pole dancer." And so sometimes you get some interesting interviews. Just digressing, the boys from 1955 apprenticeship go back every year for a reunion. I don't because of the cost, but that was just the first A380 that Qantas brought in, and it just gives you some idea of how big you are in the scheme of things when you can see people standing up underneath them, walking around. Cockpit, as most people know it today, is a glass cockpit. Underneath the cockpit floor is many of those panels full of circuit breakers, and that's the looms of wiring from them. That's the Trent Rolls-Royce engine without all its coverings on it. Missed a photo somewhere. But actually I had a photo of two engineers sitting in the front seats at one stage. I asked them what they were doing, and they both had laptop computers, and they were actually pre-programming all 4 engines in readiness for an engine run. So a bit different from nowadays, where we just jumped on board, cranked it up, checked the instruments and shut it down again. Going out onto mine sites, can be interesting, and as it turns out, when you have the need for support and assistance, you say to the guys there, have you got any means of helping me lift the aeroplane? They drop back with equipment like that. One guy said, how heavy's the aeroplane? And I said, well, if you work on a ton, you'll be safe. So he brought that back. For those who it's a bit of trivial interest, that was the 2000th Cessna into Australia, and it was VH freight free of charge. And I think finally this is just an example of a propeller that came out of its hub on takeoff in the 207 at Kununurra. It does happen, it can happen. And I think that was about 20 years ago, and we still haven't found the blade. That's the southern coast from Albany. This is called Fishless Bay, and the peaks are about 1,000 feet. It's known to probably a lot of people because it's also the area where the glider people operate. And that's looking at the bay from straight above. And if you look closely, there's an aeroplane there, a Cessna 337. Won't go into the story, it's very sad, but it turned out they were looking for reported strange drums that were sealed. And as it turned out, by the time we all got in there, the drums had been opened, the contents were taken. And the reason that the aircraft is there is because the police tried to get down. They couldn't find a way down this fairly steep incline, so they went back and hired an aircraft. Unfortunately, it became a sad story. But for the sake of the 5 of us that were going in doing the investigation over the 5-day period, that's how we got in and got out every day, by the police Kawasaki. I think this is lastly, but in the gorge, which is on the Gibb River Road and very close to El Questro, I was tasked with a job to go up and find out why a Kawasaki had crashed with passengers on board, and obviously we had potential third-party passenger claims. And I arrived in what was very hot conditions for that time of the year, and when I actually walked over to the aircraft, that whole area was bull dust, and it was a rubbish tip for the restaurant. So you can imagine what the helicopter was sitting in. It was pretty foul. And so when I got back and people asked me how my holiday was, I wasn't answering very nicely. Any questions? And the only one I can't answer you is where MH370 is.